outcry over Elon Musk is increasing, and it is not just coming from his perhaps traditional critics or the Democratic opposition. There are concerns by people who are in the Trump administration and have certain agenda ideas, and others who just think the federal government has to be run with a certain amount of transparency and accuracy over the long run, that see what Elon Musk is doing, and you've probably seen some of these reports over the week, as very concerning. We can show you the scene outside the U.S. Treasury, where Musk and allies are trying to seize what is described as sensitive or even potentially legally classified information, the sensitive payment system. Democrats speaking out.
When we open up the Senate every single morning, we don't pledge allegiance to the billionaires. We don't pledge allegiance to Elon Musk. We don't pledge allegiance to the creepy 22-year-olds working for Elon Musk. We pledge allegiance to the United States of America.
No one elected Elon Musk to nothing. We will rally. We will power a movement all across this country. Elon Musk wants power, and we will fight back.
You could see that there today, and it's a reminder that politics, governing, news, as we all live through it and share it together, it evolves in real time. And so it might not have been obvious when Donald Trump did win by 1.5 points in November that within the first month of his term, some of this round of resistance or opposition or concern wouldn't just be about Donald Trump, the person, but about a very rich, foreign-born billionaire who is exerting so much control. Substantively, you can say the Democrats and others are concerned about this. Politically, you can see from these visuals, they may think they have an opening. And Musk is going beyond Treasury. He wants to change how the federal government is staffed. And while it has become pretty popular to beat up on bureaucrats and government, when you look at recent events, when you look at your safety and security, from airports to food safety, these are not departments that most people think should just be gutted down to zero or be run by partisan hacks. So we have seen this effort to go after the entire USAID agency, to gut regulations, which, again, are written by Congress, both parties, bipartisan, over certain things where there is agreement. But now Elon Musk says he wants to just override that. There are stunning attempts to basically control levers of power in a way that we haven't seen past presidents or cabinet officers do. And remember, Elon Musk has decided he wants to hide, that he doesn't want to play by the rules, that he doesn't want to go through the basic, not very onerous, but basic transparency and ethics requirements that every other member of the cabinet does. Only he knows that. Only he knows why he wants to be so secret. The Times reports that a Trump official says Musk operates with a level of autonomy that almost no one can control. White House staff, again, these are Trump people, say they've found themselves in the dark, that Musk basically acts first, acts in secret, and lets Trump and his aides, these are presidential-level people, sort of deal with it. The Washington Post reports on a memo to federal workers, which just announces layoffs will be likely unless more people quit. Well, that raises the question, if you have so much power over those layoffs, why are you negotiating with thousands of unnamed bureaucrats that you're constantly trashing? Why don't you just do it? Again, there's a balance here. Some of this is very significant. We've reported on that. Other parts of it involve Musk and Trumpian shows and bullying and efforts to see what they can simply get away with. We should mention thousands, an estimated 20,000, are accepting the buyout offers. So again, this is a very real thing. Musk also getting scrutiny in headlines for calls to gut regulations, which does sound pretty hyperbolic. And again, someone saying this, they could be a politician or like what he is, an advisor, a kind of a special employee. But someone just saying this doesn't make it true. We all have enough experience around these things to understand that, although they do want, as I said, to strategically use uncertainty, fear, and chaos to achieve that which they otherwise might not.
I think we need to go in and do wholesale removal of regulations. Like, regulations basically should be default gone. Default gone, not default there, default gone. And if it turns out that we missed the mark on a regulation, we always add it back in. These regulations are added willy-nilly all the time. So we just got to do wholesale spring cleaning of regulation and get the government off the backs of everyday Americans so people can get things done.
That is the statement. Now, I've told you before, Elon Musk is effective at many things, including accumulating capital for himself. And he's also had some businesses that have had some real breakthrough developments. But remember, those are in areas where he devoted many years of his life. He works famously long hours, long schedules, to learn and act, and was tested by the market. What he's doing now is the opposite. He's entering an area that he knows very little about, that he's spent very little time inside of, and making grand statements which, again, he may think that they have a purpose or that they shake things up or they're disruptive, but they also reveal him as relatively uninformed about how this works. For example, what businesses do and try involves the market, and sometimes many businesses, as you probably know, their stocks go up and down. Some of them fail. Some of them go out of business. That's not the model for any viable government, let alone the United States government, a superpower that leads the global economy, that has nuclear weapons. You can't just trash all the rules that have ever been developed, putting aside even the fact that that's not allowed. I don't think the Supreme Court would allow it in the long run. But even as a thought experiment, you don't just trash every rule that's ever been made for how you run the Pentagon or USAID or federal workers or classified issues or the threats they face from abroad. You don't just trash all that and then say, if it doesn't work, if it fails, we'll bring it back and we'll replace it. The point here is that he is clearly speaking about something that he knows so little about, he doesn't realize things he's saying that make him sound so ignorant. And that's not just a political point. This is why even Trump officials are perhaps afraid of him and doing it in what they call blind quotes, anonymously telling the papers about the risk. Now, the White House is trying to protect Musk from being held accountable. Keep that in mind, because his background is not in getting you money or getting you a raise or doing anything for the American public in any public service sense. His background is accruing money for himself. And he doesn't want to play by the rules of even the other cabinet members, very top people. Some of them are also billionaires. Some of them have left their companies to do this work, not Musk. He has basically arranged a loophole where he is a, quote, special government employee. We don't know at this hour exactly what that means and how much compliance he's done with background checks or other things that are designed to protect you, the taxpayer, and the United States. His allies now say that he wants to use experimental AI as a key part of governing. The Times reports those AI tools would mostly be used to try to cut the budget, which raises the question, and we've been very open to tech on this program. There's a lot of interesting AI. We've had some AI engineers on this show. But if you elect all these humans to govern you, why would you want to just hand the keys to a billionaire known mostly for self-enrichment and AI tools, which, again, he makes money from? He's been involved in multiple AI businesses. Why would you want them to make these decisions instead of humans? And if it sounds a little odd that I have to say that as a newscaster here in 2025, well, I guess that's where we are. Meanwhile, workers are going to sue here the Treasury Department over the way that Musk has apparently been granted access to their payment system. Musk allies are saying things that could get themselves in trouble. Look at this headline about the interim U.S. attorney in Washington, who has his own set of controversies, saying something that I could just tell you we don't have any evidence to think this is valid, but I will show you what he says, quote, legal action against anyone who impedes Musk's work. That U.S. attorney, Ed Martin, has been affiliated with conspiracy theories and false statements, including going to a Stop the Steal rally on the eve of the Jan 6 insurrection. And we don't, at least at this hour, have any evidence, any material that would suggest why you would indict a person, even if they do have a fight with Musk. And by the way, if he's the bigger fish and you have a fight with him in the government, say you don't want to give him access to various materials that typically you wouldn't give to what is basically a private citizen with a relationship with the president, you could get fired for that. You might get legally fired. In other words, you could sue over that and not get reinstated. That stuff happens. But the idea that you would be indicted and threatened with jail time as the current nonpartisan, valid government employee going up against the outside billionaire, well, we just don't have any information that suggests that's possible. The courts, of course, would have to deal with it if such an indictment were made. It is possible that Musk and his allies are just saying this stuff to, again, scare people. It's also possible that they might try to abuse DOJ and FBI powers. We've covered that story, and if that happens, it will be up to the courts and the American people to weigh in on what's happening with prosecutorial powers. Musk has his own statements and standards where he's talked about how the government should operate.
I think the strong bias with respect to government information should be to make it available to the public. Like, it should be, let's be as transparent as possible. like fully transparent.
As transparent as possible is a sentence. It has meaning. Words still have meaning these days. To be as transparent as possible, he would have to follow the transparency rules he's currently breaking for other cabinet members, for other officials. As possible would presumably mean going above and beyond that and saying, well, you're so rich and you're so successful and you're saying you're in a different life stage and people should trust you. You should publicize other things. For example, how much exactly has he made off these crypto promotion schemes he's done where he's using your tax dollars and government resources and websites to promote a crypto that I'm not going to name it here because I'm not joining in his PR campaign, but I will refer to the fact that he's doing that. Why don't you tell us how much money you've made off that and how much more crypto you're holding and when you plan to sell it? Those are the type of things that are required for a lot of people, even in private commerce, like CEOs and people who have equity in businesses. And that brings us full circle. Do you know why they have to say that? Why we learn when different people buy and sell big equity stocks that they own? It's because of this thing called regulations. Regulations and rules, while not perfect and sometimes, yes, frustratingly slow, these are the rules that have passed through a process, usually through both parties in Congress and the different elected president, signed into law to protect you. And isn't it funny that the very loud, very rich, very self-involved billionaire wants all those kind of rules just canceled?
Shirley, we are starting to see a resistance to the second Trump presidency. It is, as of yet, a mishmash of activists, unions, civil society groups, and Democrats, and they are organizing against the Trump administration's onslaught against the federal government, where previous administrations have tried to seize the reins of power to immediately pursue policy goals or shifts. The Trump administration appears to be seizing the reins of power to tear it down. And in response, those in the pro-democracy camp are organizing to defend the basic functions of government. Many of the fights ahead are set to play out in the courts. Politico reports this, quote, President Donald Trump's era of retribution has begun. A wave of legal resistance is next. All eyes are now on federal courts, where challenges to these decisions are slowly starting to take shape. 2 judges have already blocked the White House from implementing its across-the-board spending freeze, and lawsuits in federal courts are potentially the last vanguard for those hoping to stop Trump's efforts to remake the federal government. The outcome of those cases will, in some ways, define the Trump presidency. As Politico mentions, judges have stopped the Trump administration's attempt to freeze trillions in federal funding. The latest rebuke to Team Trump came yesterday when a judge said that their, quote, actions in this case potentially run roughshod over a bulwark of the Constitution by interfering with Congress's appropriation of federal funds. And as for the administration's attempt to rescind the memo but still keep the freeze in place, the judge says this, quote, the court can think of few things more disingenuous. One might ask, do Republicans care that Trump is doing away with them, bypassing any kind of congressional oversight, their ostensible purpose? It seems that they don't care at all. Here's the Speaker, Mike Johnson.
I think he's taking appropriate action. Look, we're excited about everything that President Trump is accomplishing. He's doing a lot by executive authority, which we applaud, and we're going to follow that up and really reinforce what he's doing, the agenda, through legislation.
We pay his salary as taxpayers, and he sounds like a cheerleader. Joining our conversation is senior editor for Slate, host of the Amicus podcast, Dahlia Lithwick, is here. Also joining us, former chairman of the RNC, now co-host of MSNBC's The Weekend, Michael Steele is here. Michael Steele, I can see you're fired up from here. You go first.
Yes. So here's the deal. You asked the question, do Republicans care? No. The Speaker just made that very clear. You're right. He is a cheerleader for all of this. And there will be no slowing of this train. Y'all, all of us need to get our heads out of the clouds of thinking that somehow, as we were talking in your last segment, the folks say, well, I hope we can work with them. They don't want to work with you, boo. They want to take you out, and not for dinner, okay? Just so you understand what going out is. They want you out of the picture. They want you powerless and groveling. They are now the superiors. They're now the ones in charge. 50 years of retribution, and going back to Republicans complained about every little thing, all of that's coming back now. And so, yeah, I think we're in a position where we see the Speaker of the House, the Majority Leader in the Senate, just making the lane wider for the tools of destruction to flow through down that Appian way, if you will, if you need a visual. All of these things coming into the great city to tear it down and to blow it up. You know, the nominees for, Director of National Intelligence, the FBI, Department of Health, they're all getting passed. Everybody's running around this town acting like there's some controversy here, that Republican senators are concerned and perplexed and worried about, whether or not this person is qualified. They don't give a damn if these people are qualified. They don't. Why are we pretending they do? Everybody's now talking about Senator Cassidy like he's going to do something monumental, like, oh, dare I say it, vote against Donald Trump's nominee? Come on. So I think we just need to, get ourselves focused on what is coming, Nicole. And all of these, folks who stand in the democracy space, like myself and many others, we need to gird ourselves not to sit in a hunker and wait for incoming, but to go charge those battle lines and to make sure that the American people are aware of what is about to happen to them. There are a lot of families and communities, as you well know, in the health space, in the economic space, in the government space. Pick a space that will be poorly served by this administration and its ilk in the form of cabinet secretaries and undersecretaries. And people are making decisions about how we live our lives in this new America with a K.
Dahlia, the courts have replaced Robert Mueller and Jack Smith and Liz Cheney and the January 6th Select Committee as the people who are coming to save us. And I just want a sort of a reality check as to whether or not that is, one, accurate, and two, healthy.
Is it healthy? I'll do the second one first. It's not healthy. There's supposed to be a three-legged stool, as Michael says, and Congress has sort of curled up in a furry little ball at the president's feet, and that's the end of that. So we only have one entity now that can check both the legislature and the executive, and that's the courts. Is that enough? Look, I think it's useful to remember that in the first Trump administration, right, we remember what it was like in the first few weeks with the rollout of the Muslim ban and the courts that leapt into action, and not just federal courts, right? We had all sorts of, we have to remember this is a federalist system, and we have state attorneys general around the country who are leaping to the ramparts to do the work. So we don't have to just sort of hope that a couple of courts are going to do the right thing. As you said at the top, we've already seen injunctions. I think we're going to see more fairly quickly from a bunch of federal courts and from other, alarmed jurists. The real question is, and this is the one that I think a lot of lawyers are sitting with right now, is what happens when there's a court order. And unlike the Muslim ban, where we remember that the Trump administration burnished it, passed a second, burnished it, passed a third. What happens when the Trump administration says, yeah, take your court order and make me? And that's what I think, that's a classic constitutional crisis. And I think we might be days away from that. In other words, even a maximalist ruling from a court, an injunction that should stop this, not clear to me at this moment, based on the posture we're seeing right now, coming from the executive, coming from Elon Musk, that a court order saying stop this will be enough to stop this.
And let me just push you on that. What happens after they refuse to abide by a court order?
Yeah, no, then you're in the super scary territory of constitutional crisis. We've been there before. It's really a disaster for the country. And I think by and large, when you have the guy who's in charge of the FBI and the military and every computer system in the country and a court order on the other side, it doesn't always bode well for the rule of law. So I think that my view of this is if we come to that, then you really might be talking about the end of constitutional democracy as it is operated for the last 2 centuries. And I think it's really worth understanding that this seems like an abstraction because it's all kind of this inchoate fog of checks and balances and who's in charge of what. And, if the legislature is in charge of appropriations, what does that mean for me? But this is going to become, I think, really concrete and really, really real in the next few days and weeks.
All right, well.
Good evening from Seattle. I'm Chris Hayes. Last hour, Donald Trump wrapped up a lengthy joint appearance with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And over the course of a rambling, often incoherent hour, the President of the United States appeared to announce a completely unprecedented American policy towards Gaza and the people that live there that on its face would both violate international law and be seen by millions, maybe hundreds of millions or billions around the world as the U.S. backing explicit ethnic cleansing. The announcement has enormous implications for the region, for Palestinians in Gaza, for U.S. service members who apparently are going to be pressed into service for this project. President Trump announcing the U.S. would, in his words, own, that's the word he used, own Gaza, that it would transfer the population of the 1.8 million Palestinians who live there amidst the rubble and the damage, those who have survived the last year and a half, that they would be transferred out of Gaza into what he speculated could be as many as a dozen other countries that will apparently take them in. He said the U.S. would possibly send American troops to Gaza and develop the region into, quote, the Riviera of the Middle East.
The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip, and we will do a job with it, too. We'll own it, level it out, create an economic development that will supply unlimited numbers of jobs and housing for the people of the area. Do a real job. Do something different. Just can't go back.
You are talking tonight about the United States taking over a sovereign territory. What authority would allow you to do that? Are you talking about a permanent occupation there? Redevelopment?
I do see a long-term ownership position, and I see it bringing great stability to that part of the Middle East and maybe the entire Middle East. And everybody I've spoken to, this was not a decision made lightly. Everybody I've spoken to loves the idea of the United States owning that piece of land, developing and creating thousands of jobs with something that will be magnificent in a really magnificent area. We have an opportunity to do something that could be phenomenal. And I don't want to be cute. I don't want to be a wise guy, but the Riviera of the Middle East, this could be something that could be so bad. This could be so magnificent.
Now, it's a little unclear whether this was an announcement of a new policy, although it seemed to be something he deliberated on, the commander-in-chief, or it was just Donald Trump riffing off the cuff. But again, he said all this on stage with Benjamin Netanyahu after the two men had met in the Oval Office, so it seemed to be a formal policy announcement. The President of the United States saying that we need to try something new in the Middle East, and apparently something new means the American occupation and forced depopulation and expulsion of sovereign territory currently inhabited by 1.8 million people. Senator Chris Van Hollen is a Democrat of Maryland. He sits on the Foreign Relations Committee. He's been very outspoken about U.S. policy in the Middle East. He joins me now. Senator, I guess I just first, this appears to be an actual announcement of current U.S. policy that we will own Gaza, that we will go in, and that U.S. troops might be sent? Your reaction?
So, Chris, I think we need to reiterate what the President of the United States just said, and you said it, but it bears repeating. He just said that it will be United States policy to forcibly displace 2 million Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. That is ethnic cleansing by another name. He said the United States would then own the Gaza Strip and that we would develop the Gaza Strip and that other countries would take these Palestinians. He says he's talked to a lot of people and they think it's a great idea. Well, we know that just a few weeks ago, the Arab countries, key Arab countries, had an emergency meeting and responded forcefully against this idea and said it was unacceptable. So what the president is doing here is really throwing a match on an already very volatile region. This is something that Iran and our adversaries will celebrate. The super far right wing in Israel will celebrate. In fact, Ben-Gvir, one of the farthest right members, has already tweeted out his support for the president's idea. So this is a very volatile mix in addition to being despicable in so many ways.
Yeah, there's a few dimensions here it's worth, and if I sound a little stunned, it's because I really am. You know, the forcible expulsion of 2 million people is an atrocity. That's the kind of thing that, if any other nation state does it, we view it as an atrocity. You can't forcibly expel people. I'm not even clear. I mean, it's obviously a violation of international law. I'm not even clear that he has American legal authority to do something like this.
Well, certainly he doesn't have the legal authority to deploy American forces, right, to push 2 million people out of Gaza. That would require congressional authorization. He also, of course, ran on being the president who was going to stop all wars, not get us in the middle of more conflicts. So this is why it is such a jaw-dropping moment for the American people and the country, for the President of the United States to say, as you say, I mean, this isn't just like a paper violation of international law. It is ethnic cleansing by another name, and it will certainly embolden our adversaries, and it is really going to worry is a soft word. It's going to scare our friends, and this is a moment, Chris, for the Arab countries to tell President Trump that they meant what they said, that they oppose this idea, and that they believe that the only way to secure long-term peace and stability and dignity for Israelis and Palestinians alike is through self-determination for both peoples and a two-state solution. That's what they've been saying. This is really going to be a moment to look carefully at how they respond.
There's a moral dimension, there's a strategic and legal dimension, but there's also a security dimension here, and you alluded to it, but I think it's worth spending some time. The U.S. has tens of thousands of service members deployed in the Middle East. The President of the United States has just announced to the world that they are soon to be used for a project of ethnic cleansing in the most volatile, sensitive region in the world, and I can't help but feel like has essentially painted a target on the back of every service member in the region.
Well, that's exactly what he's done, because this is the most sort of volatile, toxic mix of ideas that you could bring together at this particular moment. And so it will be a moment of great danger for Americans, whether there are servicemen in the region, there are embassy personnel in the region.
Yeah.
It is such an irresponsible and reckless act by the President of the United States. Like you, I found myself just stunned. I mean, he'd been making comments kind of like this leading up to this moment, but to really announce it as U.S. policy, he also said, and we should be very alert for what's happening next, he said within the next 2 weeks, he's going to make some decisions regarding the West Bank. Who knows what he's thinking about there?
You're a U.S. Senator, and obviously you're in the minority. That means that you can't control what happens in the U.S. Senate. But there is a lot of things that U.S. Senators can do because of unanimous consent and because of the way the Senate functions. There's a kind of tacit set of norms that you all have to come to agreement on in order to have the place run. And as a senator, I know you and your colleagues like to see it doing work. At what point does it become important to use every procedural means to essentially bring the body to a halt until this policy and what's happening with Elon Musk and USAID and what seems to be a raft of flagrantly illegal actions are stopped or curtailed?
Well, I think that moment is now. I think that moment is now. And look, a group of us were outside the Department of Treasury today, essentially saying we cannot have business as usual. We're not going to let Elon Musk take over the government of the United States and take these illegal actions to stop federal funds from going to our communities, from trying to replace merit-based civil servants with political cronies, take over the payment system and get access to people's Social Security numbers. So that is now, which is why, Senator Schatz and I and others have said in response to the AID action that we're going to shut down any nominations with respect to Trump appointees in the foreign policy sphere. But I think we need to go more broadly. I've been a very clear advocate for no business as usual, given all of what's happening around our country.
I mean, the President of the United States just announced the U.S. is going to back ethnic cleansing of 2 million people. Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland, thank you for making time tonight. I really do appreciate it.
Chris, thank you.
I want to bring in NBC's Gabe Gutierrez in Washington. NBC's Vaughn Hilliard is on Capitol Hill for us. Carlos Curbelo is a former Republican congressman from Florida and an MSNBC political analyst. Lisa Rubin is an MSNBC legal correspondent. So, Gabe, I mean, this is all part of the plan as it was all along, right? Move fast, break things.
Yeah, that's the point, Chris, isn't it? And the White House will say that this is what they believe the American people voted for. They want to cut, they say, waste from the federal government. And this is what they say, that they're moving very quickly to do it. Of course, there are plenty of legal questions here on whether they can do this, but they do plan to move quickly. And as there's so many questions about Elon Musk's role in all of this. Now, White House officials say we wouldn't be paying so much attention to this if it wasn't Elon Musk. For example, even though he's a billionaire with billions of dollars in federal contracts, they see it as more of a process story. And what they're trying to focus on is this cutting of wasteful spending as they see it. Now, yesterday, President Trump was asked about Elon Musk's role in the Oval Office. Let's listen.
Elon can't do and won't do anything without our approval. And we'll give him the approval where appropriate. Where not appropriate, we won't. But he reports in, and it's something that he feels very strongly about, and I'm impressed because he's running, obviously, a big company. It has nothing to do, if there's a conflict, that we won't let him get near it. But he does have a good natural instinct. He's got a team of very talented people, and we're trying to shrink government.
So Musk is a special government employee, essentially not a volunteer, not a full-time employee, but he can only work 130 days on any given year, Chris. But the thing is that he can say he worked, say, a half day, for example. That only counts as a half day. But again, the Trump administration says that this is what the American people voted for, Chris.
Gabe Gutierrez, thank you for that. So, Lisa, there's a key question here about accountability. It's about the law. I guess it's about the Constitution. He was never elected, never confirmed by the Senate. As a special government employee, that's the proper term. Are there no rules, no limits?
Well, let's take Elon Musk out of it for a second, because you're right, Chris. He's not elected. He wasn't confirmed. And yet he is lawfully appointed as a special government employee. But think about the things that are being done in his name. Are those lawful? Is there accountability for those things? When I think about the fact, for example, that Treasury officials were forced to give access to a number of people allegedly acting at Elon Musk's direction to a payment system, there are some limits for that. For example, the Federal Privacy Act says that just no ordinary person is allowed to gain access to the Treasury's payment management system. There are rules and regulations around who can get access to that, in part because that contains many of our most sensitive and private information. The fact that DOJ employees went and got that access, we don't know whether they had the appropriate security clearances to get it, but certainly they are not people who are authorized by the existing legal framework to get that access. And on that basis, the AFL-CIO and others have sued for those actions.
So there's a legal part of this, Vaughn. Let me ask you about the political part, because Democrats say they're determined to stop Musk. But what can they actually do? I mean, and maybe a key question, can they expect any help from Republicans?
Right. Of course, there's a lot of legal questions here to this. And I was talking with Republican John Cornyn, who suggested that he expected some of these issues to come to a head in the courts here. But so far, we're not hearing any outcry like we have heard from Democrats, from Republicans who are expressing any concern about Elon Musk. They understand not only the political power, the governmental power, but also the online power that Elon Musk holds. I also tracked down Tom Tillis, Republican senator from North Carolina, and I asked him whether he had attempted to talk with the White House at all or express any concern about the access to the Treasury payment system or the OPM personnel database or to data from USAID. And he told me, why would I need to reach out to the White House, suggesting he had no concerns and that he would let everybody know when he did. But that point in time hasn't come. I want to let you listen, though, to John Kennedy, the Republican senator from Louisiana last night, who I caught up with. And the reason I want folks to listen to John Kennedy is because it had to do directly with Elon Musk and USAID and the effective crippling that Elon Musk and Doge have done internally at USAID. Take a listen to Kennedy.
Some of my colleagues are screaming like they're part of a prison riot, that this is unconstitutional and wrong, and they're very process-driven. In my opinion, they should be substance-driven. By that I mean the central question here is, what were we spending taxpayer money on? Whether the president had the authority to do it, and the allegations that Musk is copying down everybody's Social Security number, I think that's a distraction.
Whether he has the authority to do so, Elon Musk and the president, and suggesting this is a conversation that shouldn't be about process. Of course, as the congressman could attest to, so much of over the decades of American governance has been very much focused on the separation of the branches and understanding that Congress does have not only oversight of agencies, departments, but also that congressionally appropriated funds must ultimately be dispersed. I think that this is really going to be a conversation that is still so far from ultimately coming to a head. It's just beginning here up on Capitol Hill.
Oh, Congressman, just beginning. So what's your sense of why Republicans who have talked always about the Constitution and upholding the due process, are they content to let this play out? Why don't they see this as a constitutional crisis the way Democrats do?
Well, a couple things. First of all, it's early in the administration. We can expect Republicans to try to accommodate President Trump and his team as much as possible. However, the what here, which I think a lot of Republicans and a lot of people, especially those who voted for President Trump in the last election, can agree with: restructuring government, reforming government, reducing the size of government. The what, I think they're in pretty safe territory. The how matters also, though, and a reminder that all of these agencies and programs are both authorized and funded by Congress. So really, Congress doesn't have to do a whole lot for now because all of these laws and rules are in the books already, Chris. So the courts will be addressing this. And I think a lot of what the administration is doing is vulnerable to court challenges simply because it is in violation of some of the law, some of the procedures outlined by Congress. There are a host of laws that govern how the executive can conduct its business. And then you mentioned the political aspect of all of this. There's some risk there, too. Look, we've seen it many times over the last 15-plus years when one party moves too aggressively, when an administration moves too aggressively. In the next election, the pendulum tends to swing. So I think as some of these congressional Republicans start looking at fall of 2026, you can also start expecting some pushback.
So, Lisa, where is the legal line of executive power? For example, is it clear whether a president, this president, any president can just shut down an agency or an entire department that was created by Congress?
I'm going to give you a really unsatisfactory answer, and it depends. So, for example, USAID is not a creation of Congress. It was created by executive order by then-President John F. Kennedy, pursuant to a law that was enacted earlier in 1961 to sort of consolidate streams of foreign aid. But where the Department of Education is concerned, concerned, Chris, that may be a different answer. The limits of executive power, though, with respect to spending is the prerogative of Congress. It could not be more plain in the Constitution. And so when I look to Vaughn's interview with Senator Kennedy, for example, and he's saying that the substance is really great here because Elon Musk is directed at cutting spending, I'm also reminded of the fact that a federal district judge in D.C. yesterday entered the second temporary restraining order against that OMB memo that was supposedly going to freeze all federal spending for a particular period of time. And she says unambiguously in that order, whatever you call it, whether or not that memo was rescinded, any action that has the effect of carrying out what that memo said it was going to do, that's enjoined indefinitely. So if Elon Musk is continuing to slash and burn budget line items that have already been appropriated and already been awarded, he's in violation of a court order, and we're going to have to see how that's all going to play out.